Actually, Barkha has risked her life to come to Kathmandu because I just found out
I'm
off the
scared of
record.
flying.
Off the record.
Now we've said it on a mic, so it's not off the record anymore.
Totally off the record. Don't tell anyone that Barkha Dutt has a fear of flying, and
Yes.
especially smaller aircraft.
Yes.
So, but welcome here, Barkha.
Thank you,
And
thank you.
there's a certain symmetry to this because 2 years ago at the Literature Festival in Kathmandu, I was moderating a session with Shobha Dey,
Yeah.
and I heard that you were being moderated by Shobha Dey at the Jaipur Literature
Litfest,
Festival
yes.
last week.
And now here you are moderating me, so
Yeah, it's sort of come around a full circle.
right.
But I remember about, when was it, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we met at a conference in Salzburg, and we talked about TV journalism.
Yeah.
And you were not as famous then. I think you were just getting there. But I remember we talked about how TV dumbs down content, especially in news and current affairs.
Yeah.
And you were a staunch defender of TV, saying that no, it doesn't dumb down. It's actually a great contribution to public debate, and especially in India with India's democracy and vibrant free press. Do you still believe that? Because in your book, in one of these chapters, you say hashtags now occupy the space once reserved for pictures, leading to a reductionist national debate.
I think mediums don't dumb down content, people do. So I continue to believe that television can and often is a magical medium when used by people who do not want to be oversimplistic, who do not want to kill all nuance, who do not want to kill all complexity of conversation. Unfortunately, since the last time we met, I have seen more and more people in the TV industry in my country going the way of that loud, shrill, non-complex, not necessarily very intelligent sort of template for the reportage and the discussion around news. That doesn't make the medium unintelligent. That doesn't make the medium any less magical. If there is a dumbing down, if there is a death of nuance, we must blame the practitioners and not the medium.
And you were one of the practitioners, and you used hashtags as the reason why TV content is going down and the distraction of social media. But you yourself use Twitter a lot. How does that help or not help?
Well, in my book, when I say that hashtags have replaced the place that pictures used to occupy, what I do mean is that a lot of journalists today, I don't know if this happens here, but certainly in India, I feel a lot of journalists are very worried about being liked. And I always say to young people who ask me, what does it take to be a journalist? And I always say it's the willingness and the capacity for being disliked. Because what happens is the moment you want to win the popularity charts and the moment you want to score brownie points with the dominant narrative, then I know a lot of my colleagues, they get very, they would almost get like frightened by the kind of venom and vitriol that they had to face on Twitter. So suddenly I'd see on some channels, the hashtag they'd run on their show was designed to get the maximum number of hits on social media or approval of social media. I believe that it is possible to buck the trend. It is possible to still be yourself. I have certainly tried to be that, even at the cost of sometimes being told you're boring. What happens now is if you don't shout and scream and you don't, you're willing to take a position that is a little more complex than the populist position that another channel might be taking, you're called boring. So that is a risk I think we have to take. There's no point being somebody you're not. I try and be myself, but I do recognize that my industry is in a kind of existential crisis. So just like TV disrupted print, I think social media has disrupted television.
But you are a victim of a lot of trolls. I mean, especially in some cases and some reports that you've done after the Taj attack and so forth. So it doesn't rattle you at all?
It used to, I won't say rattle, it used to make me really angry. The fact that you could say anything on social media and it did not have to be true. How do you begin to address slander? How do you begin to address the fact that like for example, Wikipedia will keep saying I have 3 husbands when I don't even have one, right? And they'll use that actually to explain. And you know why they think I have 3 husbands? Because they say you have 3 Muslim husbands. And why do they say you have 3 Muslim husbands? Because they try to explain what they think is my secular politics, and for them secular is a bad word, by saying that, okay, as a woman, oh, your politics must come from there. So there's so much in that that's slanderous, it's sexist, it's misogynist, it's untrue. Similarly, you know, there have been, you know, several controversies that you can generate on online media. And a few years ago, I would get, I wouldn't say rattled, but I'd get furious. And I would get into arguments with these people. And I would say, but prove this. And how can you say this? And now I've understood that trolling is, you know, I said this to the Hindu, the newspaper, one of our newspapers, which I think published it today. And I said, trolling is actually an elaborate mind game. What people want to do is to dominate you, bully you, silence you. So it's really important that you develop a really thick skin and completely ignore these people and use Twitter for what it does, it offers you, and ignore the rest, which is what I do.
Your book, this is the book, and it's for sale here later. You can get it autographed by Barkha. You talk about fault lines of modern India.
Yeah.
You talk about, and your chapters are actually about gender, about war, terror, religious fanaticism, dynasty rule, caste, politics, and class politics.
Yeah.
But this isn't new, right? India has always had this. So what's new? What's the new angle on it that you brought?
Well, one of the reasons that I wrote this book is because I suddenly realized that my own professional journey had coincided in some ways with the journey of India post-liberalization. So, you know, I was still in college when the economy of India was first opened up, when we moved from being socialist to somewhat capitalist. And I was on the cusp of, you know, I was a college-going student on the cusp of liberalization. And then, of course, I entered television as, I like to call myself a child of television, because unlike a lot of people who migrated from print into TV, I went straight into television. And I discovered that India had changed in dramatic ways post-liberalization. You know, globalization, influences that came in from outside. You were suddenly a more open society that created its own collisions. I'm sure those conversations happen here. You know, what do you regard as nationalist? What do you regard as an outside influence? If we're all well traveled abroad, or we're educated in English school systems, are we colonized still? Are we, you know, can you decolonize without being anti-Western? So these were some of the debates. Then there were debates on, you know, the value of money and the values and the social values that arose from it. So I, in fact, write about growing up middle class in India. And my father was an Air India official who was posted in New York for many years. And when he came back, he was allowed to bring back a second-hand Mercedes without paying duty on it as a transfer of residence. And we were still in school, my sister and I, when this happened, and we were so embarrassed to tell our friends that we had this car that we would keep lying and saying we had a Fiat. Because we grew up in a time when anything that remotely smacked of money, you know, outwardly was just something to be embarrassed of. And today, we live in a completely different India where aspirational India has become the buzzword. So I think what I'm mapping is a lot of these changes.
Yeah, you you talk about the content hierarchy of the news agenda, especially on TV news, and you have to probably grapple with that all the time in your shows. Who makes this agenda, and does it fit a narrative, and it's almost like it's scripted? And here in Nepal, we've actually bore the brunt of it, mainly during the Indian media's coverage of the earthquake and the aftermath of the earthquake. And then lately, because of the blockade, I think there's almost like a blackout of news from Nepal. Whereas we are actually going through a crisis that's much worse than the earthquake, and yet there's almost nothing in the Indian press. Who makes news?
Okay, that's a great question, and I want to actually separate. You've clubbed the earthquake with the blockade, and I have to treat both of them as separate issues. One of the feedbacks, of course, that we got on the earthquake was that there was a great deal of anger with the Indian media, because the Indian media made it all about India and perhaps forgot that we were in another country, and therefore we were not sensitive to that. And while I do think that we as media practitioners should have and could have been much more sensitive, I will say that one of the things that happens in reporting natural disasters is, and this happens even when we report it at home, is the military, because areas are cut off, the areas are remote, the military becomes your one point of access to these areas. So with me, I was covering the Kashmir floods about a year and a half ago, and again the army was our army was the only way to access these areas. And once again, you don't have to go into another country for these debates to happen. A number of the Kashmiris were extremely angry with me, saying you've only told the story of the military and you haven't told the story of the local volunteers. And I said, well, no, I'm accessing the story through the militaries, and I don't believe that telling that story, as long as I'm being accurate, is something wrong. Why not? But in Nepal, I think the sensitivities were very different, because this was a sovereign nation. You were stepping in as a gesture of goodwill, and we should not have forgotten that we were in another country. But the hierarchy of news, there's no deliberate blackout of Nepal. The kind of what you see as a blackout is a very strange hierarchy of news, which is partly driven by class, partly driven by the market, partly driven by what lends itself to dramatic visuals. So, calamity, disaster, war, conflict does lend itself globally to more news coverage than a slow-moving standoff. And I will say, not with any pride, but even when blockades happen in the northeastern parts of our country, we had a long-standing blockade in the state of Manipur, it barely got any coverage. And the complaint was similar, that, why do these stories not get told, and you people are too Delhi-centric and you only tell stories about Delhi. And it's true, we have to plead guilty to this. We have to plead guilty to the fact that there is a kind of dominant hierarchy of news, and we step out of it only so often. But it's very, you're a journalist, you know this. It's very hard to tell why one thing becomes a story and another thing doesn't, right? Why does the suicide, I don't know how many of you have followed it, when in the city of Hyderabad, a young Dalit boy killed himself. Now, this is not the first suicide. This will not be the last suicide, but it is a national story. Just like the lynching of a Muslim man in Dadri, which became a national story, or the gang rape of a young woman in Delhi 3 years ago. Not the first rape, won't be the last rape, but some issues just become metaphorical, they become larger than themselves. But slow-moving standoffs, whether in India or abroad, get less space than an immediate eruption of bad news.
How do we change that? Because now you're an insider, you're inside TV. In print, maybe it is possible to take a step back and look at the long-term effects of disasters and slow-moving events. But it is a form of distortion when media tends to overcover something in the immediate aftermath and then forgets about the disaster.
But that's true for all stories, Yeah. Unfortunately, with short and shrinking attention spans, these days, every story is forgotten. Every story is a shelf life of a few days, and then you move on to the next headline and the next headline. Is that a good thing? No. There are rarely follow-ups. You rarely deep dive enough. You don't deep dive enough into a story at the level that you should. How do we change that? I think some of us have to make a conscious decision to change it. We have to be willing to put things in our program that they may not be mass interested. One of the things that I think we're all a little obsessed by is, will people be interested in this? So am I going to, on the 9 p.m. news, do something that my audience is not interested in? And how do I get my audience interested in it? And I think that is the challenge you face as a journalist, that how do you universalize a story to make it interesting to your viewers, even if it's removed from them? And let me tell you that, here in Nepal, you feel that Nepal isn't getting coverage. I covered a tsunami many years ago, and it was December, when the kind of class that watches English news is packing their bags to go off on their winter vacations. And I could not get my viewers to be interested in mass graves of children. I had to struggle to get them interested, because we are becoming more and more self-consumed, self-absorbed. Our middle classes have literally seceded from the rest of our countries. We live these self-consumed lives, and in English media we suffer a bigger disability, that our audiences are very much from these classes who want to see more and more of what concerns them. So we have to be able to break free of the market. I think that's one way of doing it.
Yeah, how do we do that? Because we see this also, and you touched upon it in your book. Do we give the audience what we think the audience wants, or what it needs? the kind of information it needs?
It has to be a mix of both. We can't any longer, in the age of social media, be preaching to people. We can't be talking down to people. We can't be assuming that we're more intelligent than our viewers and our readers. You have to be willing to have a dialogue. It can't be a monologue anymore. Equally, we should have the guts to say what we think. We should have the guts to open our audiences to realities that may be discomforting to them, that may be removed from their immediate realities. And it has to be a mixture of both, but not enough of us are doing it. And, I do feel the other problem is that foreign policy, our societies are getting more and more insular. So stories of other countries, in any case, rarely make it to our news.
I've always wanted to ask you this, or ask any Indian TV personality this, and I'm sure many of you also wonder, when you watch Indian TV news and current affairs programs, there are about 14 talking heads on the screen at the same time. I mean, is there a case to be made that there's over-debating in India? That there's just too many people talking at the same time? Not talking, shouting. So how do you make any sense out of this?
Well, I think it's pretty insane. I do think it's insane. I try and avoid that trap myself for my shows. But the best of us fall into that trap sometimes. But they do tune in to just sort of crack a joke or two, or say, this tamasha happened on this channel, gossip about it a bit. So whenever people tell us that, you guys, you're just TRP chasers, I don't know if this phrase you're familiar with, but basically you're chasing ratings, you're chasing eyeballs. And I always say that the eyeballs are you guys, right? You're the viewers. So if you reject a certain kind of content, people will be discouraged from going down that line. But the other really big problem is revenue models of news. Nobody makes money in news. And television is prohibitively expensive, unlike print and digital. And technology may one day change, but talk is cheap. And I do think that one of the reasons that there's so many talking heads is talk is cheap. The other reason there's so many talking heads is because in the age of digital media, people are not coming to television to get their news anymore. They already know their news from social media. They already know their news they can watch the ticker tape and know the news. So they're coming to you for opinion. And there's also a danger that news is being reduced to entertainment. So, you pack together 14 people, whoever shouts loudest gets heard. It becomes a sort of reductionist drama. People will watch it, bitch and moan about it, but they'll still watch that as opposed to a more sober conversation on, I would say, my program. Like I said, the perils of being called boring. Nobody wants to be called boring. And today, being serious, it has become almost interchangeable with being boring.
So do you want to interview me now?
Yeah, I'd love to.
You have...
I'd love to, in fact, throw back that question that you asked me about the media coverage to say that was that anger really felt among ordinary people here, or was that a Twitter-driven narrative, the Go Back Indian media?
Yeah, I think it was driven by Twitter with the hashtag. Some people did. People who watch Indian TV saw the insensitiveness with which Indian journalists were interviewing Nepali survivors of the earthquake. And it struck them, but I don't think it was a mass movement in that way. Just like a lot of Twitter stuff is ephemeral; it comes and goes, and then people forget about it. But there was a lingering memory of that when the blockade started happening, and I think that's why there is this sort of seething anger about. And then when Indian media does cover Nepal, it is essentially to give the party line. Which is the New Delhi MEA line or whatever. So
why would you say that?
Well, because most Indian media writing about Nepal...
a number of people, for example, there's been a very robust debate in the Indian media over India's Nepal policy, over whether we should actually be, standing up for the principle of the Madhesis to have more rights, or whether this is something that's none of our business and we should stay out of it. And, Prashant is there, he would testify to the fact that this is robustly being debated. I don't think there is an MEA line that is being taken. In fact, in some sections of the media, there was huge criticism of this line. In other sections, it was felt that this is the principle. These are people connected to India historically, and they are on the margins of political participation, and therefore India must stand up for them. So I'm just giving it to you as an example of something that there isn't actually one view on in India.
Well, I think in the beginning we didn't see much coverage. It did pick on after a while. But what we haven't seen much of is the coverage of the humanitarian crisis that Nepal is going through. I think there is a debate about, oh, China is coming into Nepal now, or there is an attempt to paint Nepal as a failure of Modi's foreign policy, but not enough about what the border blockade is doing to Nepal in general. But I think that could be because, as you say, it is removed from the Indian.
It's far
psyche.
removed in some ways, I guess.
In your book, you have 2 or 3 scoops, and one of them is that, and it happens in Kathmandu,
Yes.
that in the Hyatt Hotel, that Modi during the SAARC summit actually has a secret meeting with Sharif.
Yes.
So if you knew about it then, why didn't you why didn't you broadcast it right then? Why did you have to wait for this book to come out?
I didn't know it then.
Oh, you didn't?
I had absolutely no idea, and like many other journalists, some of them were right here in Nepal covering that SAARC summit, and I was doing many shows on it from Delhi. And like all journalists, I too thought that there was a really cold standoff between the Indian and the Pakistani prime ministers. And you know, we've known this to happen before. We've seen so many SAARC summits being hijacked by India and Pakistan, and will they talk, will they not talk, will they shake hands? And you know, this time when they shook hands, the whole hall kind of applauded, because I think the other leaders were just so relieved that this was now over, and you know, the business of the other countries could be carried on with. But we had absolutely no idea, and we totally bought into the narrative. And the foreign ministry had an official briefing saying they've met, they've shaken hands, and that's it. There's been no further conversation, and this, as we now know, and I certainly stand completely by my story, though it has very easy deniability. You know, anybody can just say it didn't happen, and I won't be able to prove that it did. But I spoke to multiple sources, and I know that it did happen. And then it was mediated by an industrialist called Sajjan Jindal, a steel baron of India. And what's really interesting is that for the first 2-3 days after the story, there was no reaction from either the Pakistani government or our own government. And then came the kind of predictable, slightly vague denials. And then many sort of, not so much later, a few weeks later, when our prime minister made a surprise visit to Pakistan, we discovered, you know, that Sajjan Jindal was right there in Lahore, and he was tweeting pictures of himself, and so, you know, so you can call it coincidence the first time, but what do you call it the second time? And so it was just, I got to know much later is the short answer.
The second scoop is regarding something quite ominous, is that during the Kargil war, Brajesh Mishra told you later that India was actually thinking of resorting to a nuclear attack on Pakistan if it dragged on, or if the Pakistanis made you know, further offensives. Now, did you believe him, or was he just saying that it was a contingency to have forward movement of the missiles on the border?
I would say that there's a third answer to that, and that is that he wanted the Americans to know that the threat of nuclear conflict could not make India accept the terms that either the Americans were trying to mediate, because they mediated a safe passage for some of the Pakistanis who came into Kargil, or that it should not make the Americans assume that India would shut down military options. So I think the assumption at that time was that the nuclear weapon would be a deterrence to war. And I think what Brajesh Mishra, who was our national security advisor, and this was actually his last interview, he gave me this interview just a few weeks before he died, what he wanted to explain to me was that there was a secret letter he carried that was written by Vajpayee to Bill Clinton, and he carried it physically, and then he told me the contents of the letter, and it said, one way or the other we will get them out. And he said, when I showed it to the Americans' eyes immediately went to that line and said, what do you mean one way or the other? And then he said, I was not willing to elaborate, but they knew what I meant. And the fact of the matter is, neither crossing the line of control was ruled out. That was certainly not ruled out. In fact, the army, as I write, the army chief of the time had prepared a 6-day war plan to open up another front for war. So if Kargil didn't work, then maybe in another part along the border. So crossing the line of control was not ruled out. And I think more than deploying a nuclear weapon, I think the message was that the fear of nuclear conflict would not stop this war. So if it was going to get nuclear, if it was going to blow up as a nuclear flashpoint, that could not be the basis for India to not explore all military options.
The book, you've also taken a very personal look in the first few chapters starting with how you, in your upbringing, because your mother was a journalist, how she introduced you to the medium and to the profession very early on, but also this whole struggle against patriarchy and the status of women in India, the epidemic of rapes later on as you covered them in your profession. And then you've also made a very brave and courageous revelation about yourself. Why did you decide to come out in the book with this?
So I basically write about my own experience with child sexual abuse in the opening chapter, and I really had to think about whether to put it in or not, because this book is not an autobiography. This book is not a memoir. It's a book about India. But the first chapter is about the place of women, and a large part of it deals with our laws, why women find it difficult to actually get justice, how the perpetrator is often within the so-called circle of trust, how often it's somebody you know, an uncle, a relative, a cousin, anybody. I mean, you know, we are debating currently marital rape and why we don't have a law on that. So I started thinking that if I do so many shows encouraging women to break the conspiracy of silence around violence, around abuse, then how could I not first break my own silence? And I had to handle it very carefully, because you know, I wanted it to be a little section in the chapter but not a story about me, but I also wanted to not feel like a hypocrite, and for me to not put it in would have been intellectually and emotionally dishonest. So that was one reason to put it in. And the second was to say that, okay, listen, it happens to all of us, and so if I can talk about it, maybe tomorrow you can talk about it, maybe tomorrow somebody else can talk about it, and the more of us talk about it, the more women will talk about it, and maybe one day we'll get to the point. And this is, you know, across countries, this is across cultures, this is a global phenomenon, and young women everywhere struggle with this, and mostly they struggle with the silence and the stigmatization of the victim as opposed to the stigmatization of the perpetrator. So that's why I put it in.
You also deal with the documentary made by Leslie Udwin,
Yes.
called India's Daughter,
Yeah.
which quite a scathing documentary and was banned by the Indian Censor Board. And you were supposed to broadcast that on NDTV.
Yes.
And was it because of the ban that you decided not to broadcast it, or because you were in support of the documentary, right? Broadcasting.
Yes, but they got the court to uphold that injunction, so we couldn't actually broadcast it. But at that time, when we were meant to broadcast it, we just carried a placard with some candles, and we sort of made up protest known in that way. But I thought what the silly ban did was that instead of debating the merits of this movie, we were suddenly debating whether it should be banned. And of course there's no debate there, because it should not be banned. It's ridiculous. I personally was on several panels later with Leslie, and I have remained uncomfortable with her decision to interview the rapist. You know, she interviewed the rapist in prison, and the point is, and the rapist lawyers who came and then said some bizarre things. Now the point is, Indian journalists may not have had access to the rapist, but they had access to the rapist lawyers, and they were these completely stupid men who come and say the most outrageous things. And a lot of us felt, why should we dignify, why should we give this platform, why should we mainstream this?
She was trying to expose them.
I know, I get her logic, I don't doubt her intention, but I remain uncomfortable with the amplification of this rapist, because this man has gang raped a young girl. He's not really going to be saying profound things. He is going to be saying the most horrific things. He is going to suggest that it's the girl's fault. It should come as no surprise to us that a man who rapes a woman thinks like this. And I am very ambivalent about it. I can be persuaded either way on this, but I am not fully convinced that the rapist should have been interviewed or given that amplification. That does not mean, however, that I will ever support that film not being shown. But the goalposts kind of shifted, right? I think we couldn't just look at the movie as a movie and discuss it objectively, because it became a larger debate then.
Yeah. I think we have some time left for questions, but before we go into questions, I just want to have one more about intolerance and the growing culture of intolerance in India. I mean, exemplified by things like Salman Rushdie not coming to Jaipur, or Salman Khan and the whole beef episode. I mean, something really tiny and can get you into a lot of trouble in India these days, and in our part of the world in general. What can the media do about it? I mean, do we keep on challenging it, or because there's a lot of risk to it too?
See, I would contest that what you call the growing environment of intolerance is linked to a recent phenomenon or is linked to political parties. For example, the Salman Rushdie not coming to Jaipur actually happened when there was a Congress government. Rushdie's book was banned on the watch of a Congress government. So we have seen both the Congress and the BJP as well as other parties politicize issues of free speech and free expression when it has suited them. Even the writers who returned awards, and I think one of them is here, Uday Prakash. I don't know if he's here in the audience, but certainly Uday Prakash was among the first to return his awards when one of our rationalists was killed. But another rationalist was again killed on the watch of the previous government. So no political party, in my opinion, has a very good record on upholding free speech, on protecting thinkers and artists, protecting them from this culture of censorship. So I don't personally agree that what you call growing intolerance is linked to politics. I think growing intolerance is linked to the changing nature of our public discourse, where today the real intolerance is for another point of view. I mean, and that intolerance comes from, like you and me, it comes from people like us. It comes from the extreme positions taken by the left and the extreme positions taken by the right, where anybody who wants to not take a side, anybody who does not want to be labeled, I don't want to be labeled, I'm not pro any party or pro any ideology, I choose my positions based on the issue. And people like me today find a shrinking space because most other people have taken sides. So I think even the debate around intolerance is a hugely politicized one now.
But it is politicized by politicians. And
but by all politicians. It's not particular to any one party. It is extreme positions have been taken by the opposition, by ruling party MPs. Some are overstating it, some are underplaying it, and in the middle, actually the real intolerance is just about coexisting with multiple points of view. And you know, there used to be, Amartya Sen had a phrase, the Economist had a phrase for us, the argumentative Indian. We used to be proud of being argumentative people who could coexist with multiple points of view. And today suddenly there's this huge pressure, but that pressure is coming from people. It's not coming from the politicians. Let the politicians take extreme positions. What do we care? Why are people taking extreme positions?
Some of them are in your show. I mean, they're the ones who get the most applause from the audience, are the ones who say the most populist, irrational things.
But that is the dilemma, right? Like it's like Noam Chomsky had a phrase called manufactured consent when I was growing up, and now it's become about manufactured dissent. So some TV shows are assembled by deliberately placing people who disagree because the audience likes that. So, you know, when we talk about intolerance, we also have to look at ourselves. What is our... I believe that this intolerance debate has now become a bit of a cliche. You know, even in India, it started evoking groans and yawns because it has been hijacked by the politics of it. Whereas for me, the relevant debate around intolerance is live and let live. Live and let live. Let multiple points of view coexist.
Okay, anyone want to ask any populist, irrational questions? Hang on, yes, let's go here first, and then after that, Narayan.
I am Krishna Kesi. Particularly, I have come here to ask the questions also with that purpose also. But I would like to welcome Ms. Barkha Dutt here. Particularly, she has particular was the risk to be here also. But weather did not permit you particularly to watch our this festivals also. You would have been particularly lucky if the weather had favored you. Anyway, but I am the keen watcher of your programs. Yes. They are particularly Sunday programs. What's called that We the Peoples also. There the buck stops here also. Your daily show also particularly, and in those programs what do you do, what you particularly different particularly related to the army jawans also, then particularly war whoopee also you did the many more shows also, but this area is particularly where you are particularly sitting here for the programs. This is the areas particularly it contributes the large number of Indian jawans from this Gurkha Japans in the Gurkha regiment from this place, and particularly particularly what with this whatever particular what we call this economic blockade, the families, even the serving Gorkha Jawans and particularly the officer JCOs, they are getting support with that also. So what I would like to request is, but even Indian media are not paying attention towards, either that is the electronic media or that is the what are the print media also, they are not paying attention towards this also, substantial attention towards this also.
Thank you.
You talk about you talk about the Prashant Jha is accessible in the Indian media. Once I watched with the Nidhi Rajdan in the Central Life or that programs, but it's not at the time, particular in what way those peoples are being suffered, particularly it's not at the particular roles of the Indian media, particularly to tell some things about those. They have fought for to protect the Indian sovereignty.
Just linking the debate on the level of intolerance, could we talk about the level of independence of media in India?
Thank you.
How free are you, in fact?
Good afternoon. I'm Baby Biston. I have a question to you. Indian media have been creating confusion among the people by spreading propaganda such as China is coming to Nepal to destroy India, Lumbini is in India, and Nepal is unsafe place to visit. Like this one, Indian media, they want to destroy our tourism.
come on.
What's your view about it?
Should there be more story about this standoff, given especially the history of the Gorkhas? I agree. I think there should be more coverage. I think we spoke at length about some of the issues that prevent it from getting more space. And I gave you an example of even places within our country where there have been blockades for weeks and weeks which don't get told, and I've already accepted that this should change. So I hope that addresses your point. How independent is the Indian media? I would say the Indian media is very vibrant and actually more or less fully independent. And why do I say that? The example of the documentary is a key example. The documentary got banned, but my channel held up a protest placard at the time that the documentary was supposed to air. The fact of the matter is that every day there is some or the other critique of the government, of politicians. I don't remember a time when I have ever been asked to hold back a story in 20 years. There is no story that I have wanted to tell that I have not told. There is the tyranny of the market. You know, when people talk about the media not being free, most people assume that oh, politicians must be interfering. I think Indian democracy has reached a point where politicians cannot interfere. You cannot kill a story. But one of the things that unfortunately makes our media a little more classist is this need to get ratings, because advertising revenue is linked to it, and therefore sometimes you don't tell stories that you should because you think your audiences are not interested. And I think that is actually a little more lethal for our independence and than any political establishment. I don't at all feel worried about government interference. I feel more concerned about the market-driven nature of the media. And to your last point, there is no conspiracy. Why would the Indian media want to stop tourism? Why would I be here if I felt that? I'm here, right? Why?
Brave girl.
No, come on. Except for my fear of flying, nothing brave about it. But I think what happens is Indians can forget that we are from a large country in the neighborhood, and smaller countries have sensitivities and great pride. That just like we have national pride, I think the fact that all of you clapped for your question shows that there is a pride here that needs to be valued and recognized. And I think the Indians can be bulldozers in some ways. We have bulldozer type personality, and we think only of ourselves and not of countries around us. But that is completely unintentional. It's nothing to do with any lack of affection for the people here or for the places here. I think there are deep cultural and historical ties that go back forever. And this is my 4th or 5th trip to Nepal, and I would love to come back. And I'm sad I'm here on a day when I can't see the mountains and it's cold, and I'm sure I'll be back. So there is absolutely no intention at all of offending the people or, you know, and as far as incorrect facts, we have incorrect facts even about stories in our own country. That is just bad or lazy fact checking. It has nothing to do with any animosity towards another country.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first one.
My name is Ravi Rajbaral. I was expecting that Kunda will ask this question, so I have to ask you.
Go ahead.
Can you please tell us in short that what is Radia tape controversy and how or why Indian media blocked this, and what is your relation with that controversy? Can you tell
Well,
us?
in the
actually, it's
book.
in the book.
It's all in the
but
book.
I don't mind answering it.
Can we take one more?
Yeah, sure.
Hi Barkha, welcome to Pokhara.
Hi, thank you.
It's me, Deepak Shrestha. Actually, as an audience, I love to see the television for a purpose of entertainment. And I mostly like to go through the Indian media and news channel because they entertain us very much.
But then you proved my point.
And yes,
That means
yeah.
you like all that shouting and screaming.
Definitely, please, let me say. And after the long run, finally the Bollywood industry, comes with the movie People Live. And it replaced the Indian TV channels to comparing in a comedy show. But as a professional journalist, how did you analyze it? And how did you feel after the release of People Live? Thank you.
Okay, so very quickly on the Radia tapes, I've actually written about it in the introduction to the book. I have a very different take on it from what you may have read on the internet and so on. My job as a journalist, according to me, is to source information. I will source information from a PR person, from a politician, from a peon, from a crook, from a criminal, from anybody who gives me information. For me, information is sacred, the story is sacred. Who gives me that story is not relevant. And therefore, as somebody who represented two of India's biggest industrialists, almost every journalist in Delhi knew her. There is not some particular, affinity between her and me. She represented Ratan Tata and Mukesh Ambani. She's somebody we all knew because that's how we would source information officially from the corporates. And she was at that time very close to one of our southern parties, the DMK, and I was covering this party had walked out of the government because our then Prime Minister did not want one of those guys in the cabinet. And she basically wanted to know what I'd heard from the Congress. I wanted to know what she'd heard from the DMK. We traded information. My position on that is very simple. Watch my story. Watch the story I did after that. What conversation I had is irrelevant. The story I did was all about Manmohan Singh not wanting this guy because he's meant to be corrupt. And that is the story that I believe I should be judged on, I should be measured on, and I think I have been measured on. I mean, it's been 5 years, 6 years, I've answered every question on it, I've written about it. So for me, really, it's a non-issue except for the hurt I felt at my integrity being questioned. I was furious at that time, and so I kept sort of getting into arguments over it. Now I'm very calm about it, and I write about it in my book, so if you open the introduction, you'll find everything you need to know about it. Now, what was your question? People Live. Has the media become a joke? Has the media become a bit of a caricature? Yes. But I also think it's a bit of a, it's convenient. Media bashing is fashionable these days. Please, okay, forget me. Some of our young reporters in smaller towns of India, and stringers especially who don't have full-time jobs, they go without food, they go without water, they go without good salaries, and they do this all for a story. Reporters go into war zones, they risk their lives, they don't have the protections that I do. In our smaller towns, they are at the mercy of localized political systems, threats and so on. It's very easy to trash the media. Try doing our job. Please try doing our job for one day and tell me then if you still find it easy. I think being a journalist is amongst the toughest professions in the world, and only now has it started becoming a job where you can make a comfortable living. Most journalists who became journalists, at least in my generation 20 years ago, did not do this for the money. We did it simply for the passion and simply for the love of telling a good story. And I think it's lazy to trash the media. Yeah, we have faults, but which profession doesn't?
Why did you have to write a book about it, though? This one.
The book is not about the media.
No. I mean, a book about yourself, and why did you, at your present time in your career, need a book?
Because I think everybody should reinvent, everybody should face new challenges. If you do the same thing over and over again, it becomes easy. I don't say this in a boastful way, but you get formulaic. And when you get formulaic, you get rusty. And when you get rusty, you start performing less than your optimal output. That was one reason, to throw myself a new challenge. I'd never written before, I'd only written for television. And the other reason was that I believed that my journey as a journalist coincided with many changes in India, and that I'd had a ringside view to contemporary Indian history, and I should write it before I forget it.
are you satisfied with the format of non-fiction, or would you like to go for novels or script writing or
No, I
a
would.
movie?
I mean, I know journalists are meant to be storytellers in the most sort of uncomplimentary ways, but most seriously, no, I would not.
Because some novelists actually say that to get closer to the truth, you have to write a novel. Sometimes just to fictionalize some characters who come to life and probably be closer.
Perhaps, because you don't run the risk of actually writing about real people who will then hold it against you. That's one peril that a practicing journalist like myself. I mean, there are any number of people who will not talk to me after this book, and they're not happy with what I've written.
They aren't talking to you, or they will not talk to you.
They won't talk to me, at least for now.
Okay.
They are not talking to me, and have conveyed that to me, and that's something you live with as a journalist. That's fine. I would write fiction if I had the skills to. I just do not believe that I have the skill that is needed when you spend a long time of your life chronicling real life, it is very difficult to surrender to your imagination, and it is very difficult to find the language for that imagination. I just don't have it.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our session. I just want to make a poll here. How many of you have watched Barkha on TV? Just raise your hands.
Not so many. So
Maybe you should do it in Hindi. Anyway, okay. Thank you very much, Barkha, for taking your time. Thank you for coming, and have a smooth flight that I hope is not very bumpy.
I hope that. Thank you.